that is, this is a new series that is really meant to help us unpack big network related topics. It is meant to complement our other open learning sessions that we offer through Collective Mind. We have Networks 101, Network Management 101. We offer each of those every month. And then now rotating every other month with these networks and actions, we have community conversations that are more focused on peer exchange and learning, still on network topics, but more focused on experience sharing. So a slightly different approach and format to those sessions than these, wherein, again, we're going to take big network concepts and try to unpack them. We will not unpack everything. This is not the end all be all, of course, of any topic that we take on in one of these sessions, but we are gonna, dig as far as we can, as deeply as we can. So again, assuming you have the link to the slides, if you could go to actually slides 3, 4, 5, and 6, I added a whole bunch. Again, we had lots of signups for today, so perhaps we'll have more folks joining us. But if you want to just introduce yourself briefly, say hello, answer the questions about who you are, what your network or organization is, where you are in the world today, and how are you feeling? I'm feeling, so I'm Kirsten. I'm the founder of Collective Mind. I am based in Washington, D.C., and I am feeling excited, but a little bit nervous about this session since it's the first one of this series. So the pressure's on to make it good. But that's great. So yeah, if you just want to introduce yourself in these slides. And if you're new and don't have the link, Seema will send it to you individually. This is our shared link to our shared slides here. And welcome everyone from all over the place. That's great. And you can use, if you're running out of space, feel free to use another one of these. That's why we've got multiple slides of the same. So, okay. All right. So let's get started. So again, anybody that's coming new, this is our Networks in Action, the first one of these of this new series. This one today, we're focused on equity. And our agenda for today is in slide 7. So we are in the middle of our little welcome and check-in, saying hello to each other in the slides up above. And in a second, I'm going to give you just a brief presentation to set the scene. This presentation is based on all of the inputs that you all shared in your registration form for this I think I said that right, for this session. The format for this Networks in Action session, which we plan to use for every Networks in Action session going forward, is a modified version of a facilitation technique within the sphere of liberating structures. If you don't know liberating structures and you want to work on your facilitation techniques, I highly recommend you check out liberating structures. This format is a what, so what, now what format. Typically, in liberating structures, that is a sort of after action review, a retrospective view of things. We are going to use it more in the present. We are going to talk about, well, what does this topic mean for us? The what? So what? Okay, well then what, if that's our definition of this topic, what does that mean for our networks? And then now what being, okay, well then what are the implications? We've had this conversation. What are the implications? What are the key takeaways? So that's our format for today. Again, laid out in slide 7. And we're going to go back and forth in small groups as well, so that you can have some conversation with your colleagues in this group and work on this together, really, which is our goal. So let me give this brief presentation, and then we'll kick off this interactive phase of today. So The presentation slides, there are many of them because you all shared quite a lot of very substantive feedback. So very many thanks to all of you. So there are a lot of slides that outline this, and hopefully they will be useful to you, whether you get to digest them all right now in the moment, which I think is probably unlikely because there's a lot of feedback there. But if you want to come back to this at a later point, you are more than welcome. So slides 8 all the way down to 15. So again, these are organized along these same the same framework, right? The what, so what, now what. So in our early slides here, slides 8, 9, and 10, we asked you how you define equity. And my attempt to synthesize and summarize this is laid out here. Again, this is one way of looking at this. This is not the end all be all, but from what I saw in the responses that you all shared to how you define equity, I tried to organize and synthesize those responses around these sort of 3 different categories or buckets. So one being about justice, right, which you see on slide 8, justice, fairness, recognizing we don't all start from the same place, providing a level playing field, etc. So justice. Slide 9 around access, that we all have equal opportunities, regardless of where we come from, who we are, and thereby we have the ability to access and make use of the resources we need to thrive. And that isn't predicted by our identity. And then thirdly, slide 10, this idea of respecting and meeting differences in the sense of meeting people where they are. So understanding that we all come with our own individual experiences, circumstances, identities, but that means that we need to meet people with those differences in mind. And likewise, not, as mentioned, not predict our outcomes based on identities. So really trying to meet people where they are on their terms based on their individual needs. Again, when we're thinking about defining equity, this was my attempt to synthesize what you all shared. This is not the final word on what equity means or how we define it, but this is an attempt to synthesize what your views were and try to organize our thinking a little bit. We'll come back to these in just a moment when we start that piece of the discussion. Moving on to the so what. So again, you all shared ideas about what equity means for your networks. These are laid out in categories from slides 11 to 13. So again, trying to synthesize and summarize, placing things in some categories. So as I read and heard them, I saw a few things. I saw there's serious implications around equity for participation in our networks. What does that look like? What does that mean? How do we ensure that everyone has a seat at the table, that everybody gets a voice, that we create inclusive and safe spaces that are diverse and where everyone feels respected? Then on slide 12, there are implications for how our networks work. So how do we articulate and live our values? How do we ensure that everyone is welcome? How do we ensure that we have diversity on a practical level? How do we bolster that? How do we support people to show up in all facets of our work? How do we manage power? And how do we trying to ensure decision-making that is more equitable and inclusive. And then finally, there was the sort of opposite piece of that, which is I see that as slightly more inward looking. And then there's this sort of outward looking piece of the work of our networks. So what is our network trying to do? What is it trying to achieve? And what does equity mean for us in that way? How are we working in the world around us in the context in which we want to achieve our shared purpose? And what does that look like in terms of equity and trying to, for example, remove and transform oppressive systems or share resources, work across different elements, work intersectionally. So again, looking outward to what we're trying to achieve as our network and how equity and understanding and integrating equity has implications for that work. And then finally, that left us with a number of questions. So your responses to the now what are the equity related challenges? So there are a lot of them and they are mostly just listed here with a little bit of synthesis, but in slides 14 and 15. So what does this mean? How do we address this then? If we define equity in certain ways, if we want to address it in the ways that we work internally, externally, what does that mean? What does that leave us with in terms of the practical implications for how we show up and how we adjust our approaches, interact with colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So a wide range, a long list. I'm not going to go through them in depth, but lots to chew on there, I think. And again, we're just sort of skimming through this, but you are more than welcome to come back to these slides and look more closely at all of this at a later point. So I'm going to be brief and leave it there, but there's certainly a lot of substance, and many thanks to all of you for sharing your ideas and your feedback, because that's what this is based on. Before we move into our process and break into groups to talk about our definition, which is the next step here. Any questions, clarifications, anything coming up right now that you want to ask or share? Perhaps just overwhelmed by the amount of feedback that your colleagues shared here. There's a lot of substance. There's a lot to work with there. All right.
I'll go, Kirsten.
Yes, yes, Anthony.
Yeah, I think oftentimes we confuse justice with equity. And I think I almost wonder if it's like noise or distraction to conflate the two, because equity is something totally different than justice. And it's almost like we want to put layers between ourselves and people, and some of those layers sound in justice, some sound in whatever, versus all meaning all, and really just moving to that space.
Mm-hmm. Could you clarify the difference in your view between equity and justice?
Well, justice implies a system, right? It implies legality. It implies some sort of process to achieve or right a wrong or something. Equity is something totally different than that. Mm-hmm. We're honest about it, right? It's something totally different.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you for that. Other thoughts, anything in response to that, or just in general? This is a great way for us to segue. We're going to break out in just a second and go to this point around the what, and have a breakout discussion about our definitions. And we can look back to these slides 8, 9, and 10 that try to sort of categorize and synthesize what the feedback was to that question. But I think we're already seeing there's some complications, let's say.
Yes. I had a small comment. I think we conflate the two, because if there is no equity, then there is injustice, or there is perceived injustice. And maybe this is why we often find discussions around the space including both terms. Maybe not because of the confusion, but because of the kind of inevitable consequences of inequity.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So let's continue this conversation. We're going to move into small groups. just for a very brief amount of time. We're not going to solve all of this, as I said, right? We're not going to completely grapple with every bit of this, but the idea is to explore this topic. So we're going to break into groups, and Seema, if you can organize that for groups of about 3. And in your groups, again, this group, we're talking about our definitions. So you can refer to those slides 8, 9, and 10. You can reflect on what's just been shared. You can talk about whatever is coming up for you. We're just going to spend 5 to 7 minutes. Again, this is not the super in-depth exercise that it could be, but we're trying to explore these topics, right? And what we'd like to do so that we can capture what's coming up so that we can share within the group is have every group write their definition in these slides 17 or 18 if we're running out of space. So this does not have to be a formal, final, perfectly articulated wordsmithed definition, but each group, it would be great to hear what you're talking about, right? So that we can reflect on each other's ideas. And so please do, from your group, have someone capture the sort of final-ish thinking in one of these slides, 17 or 18. Okay, so we're going to talk about our definitions. We're going into these breakouts. We'll take 5 to 7 minutes. It'll be quick, but we will have a little discussion about what this means. So Seema, whenever you are ready, and we will see you back here in a few minutes. Hello, welcome back. All right, welcome back. I'm sure we solved all the things in the 7 minutes that we had to solve them. So I see that some folks were putting their reflections into the slide 17, which is great. Thank you for that. So if anyone wants to take a look there, if you haven't already, some interesting ideas coming up. Any key ideas or reflections that you'd like to share with the whole group?
Just realized I'm still unmuted. I think something I shared with my group that was an aha moment as our organization has been studying this for the last 9 months, and that is that it's important to remember that this is not just cultural and racial, but it's sexual preference, religious preference, and that we need to kind of keep all of that in mind as we talk and think about equity.
Great.
I don't want. No.
Go ahead.
Jennifer, please go ahead, or whoever was talking.
Sorry, that was me. I think you're good. I think Anthony, go ahead.
I want to put. I'm not gonna butcher her first name, but Miss Daly. I think I can enunciate. She asked a wonderful question near the end of our session. I think it's important for this. I'm sorry if you're.
You're being put on the spot, I think, to share your question.
Oh, it's Hadra, and yeah, I was just saying. Well, I was just asking Anthony. When we think about justice, it's in a sort of legal context. But what if we started thinking about justice in terms of social justice, and does that feel different? But that was just me sort of thinking out loud. But yeah, we didn't get around to discussing if that sort of takes away from the kind of legal stuff. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and my soft response was that it opens up Pandora's box. So there's a psychological human phenomenon, dare I dip my toe in that happens where even with trauma, we know we're dealing with people who experience trauma, but then we layer that with secondary trauma. And then we start focusing internally in our organizations and groups and teams on that secondary trauma as a distraction almost, as a way of not fully dealing with the main issues. And so we have these layers and categories, and they are distinct and they are important, right? But all means all, right? And we need to be honest about the, what did it call it? The social industrial complex regarding nonprofits and the people they serve, and that recycling funding cycle and things of that nature. And do we really want people to get healthy and be treated equitably? And what does that do for our jobs and our work and things of that nature? Sonia, I see you nodding, but I don't know, this may sound a little, wonky, and it is huge, right? So I don't know, Kirsten, that's my comments, thoughts.
No, that's great. I think you're helpfully segueing us, Anthony, in each of these rounds, it seems, towards the next one, because I, as I'm hearing you, at least in my head, I'm thinking about how what you're posing, takes us to this next question of the so what, right? So if this is our definition, why does that matter? What does it matter? How does it matter within our networks? So then if we're thinking about equity and we want to further equity, presumably, so what are the implications for our networks, and how we work in those networks? Other thoughts or reflections before we, again, I know we're just like sweeping through this really large topic that we could take months and months, years for that matter, to discuss and really unpack completely. But any other thoughts before we move to this next question of the so what?
I actually wanted to jump in and address something that Jennifer said. I do think that we tend to have a tendency when talking about identity markers to think of them as discrete things, discrete categories. I just want to offer that somebody who is represented by, or not represented by, who inhabits a body that has been racially marginalized, right, could also be experiencing marginalization based on their sexual orientation. And that impacts, like within the LGBTQ community, right, like people who come from racial or cultural backgrounds that are marginalized are going to be impacted even more so by the marginalization that comes from sexual orientation, and then vice versa as well. So I do want to just say a word of caution against like bucketing things so concretely, because many of us do inhabit multiple marginalized identities.
Mm-hmm.
Kirsten, if I may, can I ask Sonia a question? I don't know. Because this race thing, if we're really honest, right? Race is a social construct. So it's, where do we anchor it? Do we anchor it in, 1607, the 1700s, when all of this framing came about, or do we anchor it in the experience of now, which leads to some of the dynamic that Sonia is eloquently bringing out, where, we get into that intersectionality more, but we never really go back and link it to the historical framing in that structure of things. And those are two totally different realities. One leaves us infighting against each other, and then one really ties it to that structural, white body supremacy that we're addressing.
Yeah, I think it's important to, as you just said, recognize that race changes over time because it is a social construct, and the decisions that were made in 400 years ago, centuries ago, are still impacting us today. So we need to be like aware of the historical context of race many years ago, when the people who created the many systems that are still in effect today, like what were their intentions? How did they how did they see the world? How do they see specific people in the world, while also recognizing that those racial categories may not be the same today, even if we are feeling the impacts of them, if that makes sense. I don't know if that like fully answered your question, but all the questions you're asking, I just want to say are, yeah, huge, as I said in the chat as well.
So let's move into this next key question, which is the so what. We are again looking at, well, if we're thinking about equity through all these lenses and with all of these sort of elements to it, what does that mean? What are the implications for our networks and how we work in our networks? So let's take one more round, different groups, and again, a fairly short amount of time, but to talk about what this all means then. So thinking about for you in your networks, what are the implications? What are the key implications? Obviously, there are probably many, but what sort of maybe rises to the top in terms of the implications for your network and how you all work in your network. So, and if we could capture any thoughts to share back in slide 19, that would be great. Seema, we can reconfigure our groups. We'll have about a similar amount of time since we only have 1 hour here together to talk about this so what question and the implications. Okay, the rooms are open. Okay, all right, welcome back. We have some shared thoughts in the slide. I know we're just like whipping through these quite big questions in our format for today, but just we're going to use the rest of the time to reflect. So any sharing from this last breakout that you'd like to share with the rest of the group, and then moving our thinking into, okay, now what? That final question, well, what does this mean for us going forward? So any thoughts or reflections that you want to share from the breakouts?
I guess I could speak for our room, room 3, we were just talking about it. I think the greater theme that we came across was representation in kind of our 3 different categories of work, which was interesting. We were kind of just generally talking about equity and how it manifests, and representation was the key theme for all 3 of our different types of works. And it sort of kind of came to be like, the leadership should be representative of, the network members, and same with just members. The members themselves should be, representative of, who they are serving, like the work that they're doing, like our organization is a national organization. So, our membership should be representative of all different places around the country. So just kind of like a physical representation, and just, yeah, that kind of thing. Representation.
Thanks. Other thoughts, other things that came up?
Sonia, you did such a great job of explaining that. I don't want to put you on the spot, but she had some really great thoughts around just the fact that one person, one organization can't possibly think of every way that someone could be potentially marginalized. So Sonia, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it was just really, really great the way that you framed that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think thanks, Jennifer. And I think in our conversation, we were talking about how it's so hard to think through, like, okay, what are the different identity markers of populations that we need to be elevating, especially if you have a pretty broad network, right? There are a lot of, people who are impacted by systemic inequities. So what I was offering is that while it is important to think those things through, I think we often get stuck in that phase instead of moving to the next phase, which is to build upon the initial conversation about, the people or organizations or, identities that we may want to lift up because they, because there are so many things impacting their ability to share, to participate, things like that, and moving more into the structure of like, how do we build community so that when something happens, when somebody feels harmed, when we are witnessing an inequitable, outcome in action, how do we make sure that we're able to self-reflect, have the structures to address that? Because the reality is, like, we're all limited by our own perspective. We're never going to be able to be like, to think through, okay, in what possible way, how do we make sure that every single person in the world is included in this, right? It's an important goal, but it's just not possible from one person. So how do we make those structures so that, when something does happen, the person who is harmed feels like they can surface it to the group and leaves the conversation feeling whole and like something is going to change moving forward. And so I tend to think more in terms of how do we build out those structures instead of necessarily thinking about the different buckets that we need to like check off, kind of. Not that those aren't important too, but.
Great, thank you. Other reflections to share? Or perhaps in response to our third and final question in this session, which is now what? I recognize that we, again, really sped through this topic that we could inevitably spend much, much more time on. But, what has come up for you? Has anything come up for you in terms of going forward, key takeaways, thoughts that maybe have shifted a little bit and might impact how you do your work going forward in a slightly different or a majorly different way? Now what happens now?
I'd be really interested to know, maybe people who are further along, just how do you go from like discussion to actual action? Like that just always seems to be the problem. I was saying in my group, like I think in both groups actually, like there's a lot of good intention in my organization, but it's just the follow through, and I don't know how to like, I don't know, encourage, galvanize people into something tangible in a way that doesn't feel like I'm annoying, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if anyone's, I don't know, like something really practical of just being like, you had a conversation with this person and this person, you decided that you're going to trial something. I don't know. It's just, I don't really know what the best approach is to go from, we want to be more equitable. I just feel like I'm 6 months into the role and I've spent like the entire time, it sounds like complaining, but it's more just, I'm really like, we need to do something. And I don't know if anyone's got any tips, or if it's just, we just have to be the annoying people, then it is what it is.
It's not complaining if it's productive.
Right. Yeah, you have to, I think, do several things. One, create space in the form of maybe a ritual to have these kinds of discussions in a more formal way. I think two, you have to own several things, like, so some non-negotiables. History is one of them, right? How we talk about that history is really, really important. I talk about European dudes becoming white dudes, right? In the American context. And that's really, really important because that's exactly what happened. And then you have to dive into the socialization piece. And for me, it's systems, tools. There's this ladder of connectedness that's really, really important. And then it'll allow you to talk about empathy and awareness in a more structured way. And what do we mean by those? It really goes back to our behavior. We skip that part and tend to focus on commitment. And the other thing is bringing in these like system thinking tools. There's some business tools, 6 conversations that matter, where you're inviting people to this table that hasn't been set before. And I think being cognizant of that and not getting in the problem solving mode, but really innovation is really, really key, because we tend to problem solve. And we can't ignore the one salient fact is that white supremacist culture is us, all of us. It's not outside of us. It's in all of us. We've all been impacted by it. We've all been harmed. We've all caused harm. So it's a journey almost together, in even in re-articulating it that way than something you're trying to fix outside of it. I don't know if that's helpful, but it's really, if you look at any business model, if you look at, there's this thing called creative tension. Dr. King talked about it, but it's that, what is our current reality, and then what is our desired reality? And the goal is to hold that creative tension, and most of us don't. If we're really honest, we settle. We take the easy road. Just owning it. That's kind of refreshing, or was for me.
There's also some interesting clues that you could get from your community by talking to your community members about the unpleasant experiences that they've had, to bring those to light. So something like, I felt a power imbalance when, and people can complete that sentence how they wish, or I wish I would see this community doing whatever, and they can complete this. And I think, yes, it's not the kind of survey we are used to. We are used to doing more celebratory surveys, what is really going well, but actually it's what's not going well that really shines a spotlight on these system thinking and system changes we need to do. I think sitting with our discomfort is the hardest part for this, but it's necessary. It's a necessary part of the work, and it's difficult, but once we start the journey, then the discomfort becomes also enlightening.
So we're going to leave it there. Again, we could keep having this discussion for an indefinite period of time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing and reflecting and being a part of this. There is a feedback survey in slide 18. We'd love to hear from you. Again, this is the first one of these. So learning as we go. I think this topic was certainly biting off perhaps more than we could chew in one of these sessions. We will be rotating these every other month. The next one of these, Networks in Action, will be in April on the topic of network management and neutrality. So come back for that session. There are some other upcoming opportunities in slide 19. We will share back the slides, which you can feel free to look out further. And yeah, I think that's it. We are at time. Again, really grateful for your participation, for your presence, for your sharing, your ideas. You're willing to perhaps sit in a little bit of discomfort. So let's go from here. And yeah, thank you all so very much.
Thank you.